So as you can see, ethics is a complex topic, and one of the reasons why it's so complex is that really there's no objective standard to determine what the right thing to do is. And so this short video is trying to wrestle with this problem about the nature of ethical decision making. Anything that we're talking about in this little section, or that I'm talking about, is not to convince you one way or the other, or to say ethics isn't important, but it's to make you think about what it actually means when you say, oh, I believe this is ethical or that is unethical. What's actually going on there? What kind of value judgment are you making? To do this, I want to differentiate between two different kinds of decisions or actions that we want to take. Economists have for some time understood the difference between these two different kinds of decisions that people make. One set of decisions that you'll take are judgments, and the other are preferences. And there's a big difference between the two, and that can help us think about ethics. So let's get into it. So when we think about decisions, most of the time we're thinking about judgments. So judgments are the kinds of decisions where there is a right or wrong answer. What is 2 + 2? There's a correct answer to that, which is 4. When you make a decision about that answer, it will be either right or wrong, because you can work out whether it's right or wrong. But also in life, there's a lot of things where there is no right or wrong answer. For instance, do you like the music of Snoop Dogg? Right? There's no right or wrong answer to that. You either like the music or you don't like it, or you might be indifferent. Or do you like chocolate ice cream? Or do you prefer vanilla? Now, if you said, hey, I like Snoop Dogg's music and I like chocolate ice cream, people can argue that they're wrong, but there's no basis for it, right? In fact, really, from a kind of logical perspective, they can't argue that you're wrong. That's just what you prefer. So there are these kinds of decisions that we need to make to which there is no objectively correct answer. So the challenge that we face in ethics is that different ethical frameworks or different ways of deciding what is ethical can give you different answers, and there's no objective way to show that one is better than the other. So because of that, your ethical orientation is more of a belief or a preference than a judgment. That's why two people can totally disagree about what the ethical thing to do is in the exact same situation, and both of them can be ethically justified. Now, in saying this, I'm not trying to dissuade you from holding an ethical position. I just want you to understand the nature of the position that you're holding, that it's closer to a belief than it is to an objective decision-making that's provable. So the major outcome from this is to recognise that often there's no way to prove that your ethical position is the correct one. Now, I will grant you that in some kinds of situations, many ethical frameworks will give you the same answer. So that's to say a certain course of action is probably ethical or unethical there because the frameworks align. But in many circumstances, the frameworks that we'll discuss next week in particular don't align. And so what do you do then? Okay. Well, then it's about engaging with the material and thinking it through. Just because there's an irreconcilable difference in answer doesn't mean that you can't challenge an ethical framework. If an ethical framework throws up a problem, it can be inadequate. So, for instance, utilitarianism throws up the problem that it oppresses the minority. Kantian or deontological approaches tend to throw up the problem that they're far too strict and ignore consequences, right? So these frameworks have their own problems, and that gives you a hint that using that framework, you might want to think a bit more deeply about that particular ethical problem and not just follow it blindly. What you're actually going to do there is use multiple frameworks in order to try and wrestle with the problem and come to the most ethical resolution that you can given the circumstances. And as our key takeaway here suggests, the problem with ethics is not so much about applying a framework blindly, it's about engagement. not absolute proof. You've got to reason through why you want to do something and then choose based upon that. Otherwise, you'll be making decisions without thinking about the ethical consequences and some of the potential downsides of your natural orientation. So this problem of preferences and judgments flows through into society and into business. You can remember that when we're talking about relativism, it's this idea of, is there a standard? And an absolutist would say, yes, there is. But what is that standard? If you default to what everyone else thinks or what is considered good business practice, you're actually probably not talking about ethics per se. You're going to be talking about social norms or best practice. Unless you've reasoned through the ethics, seen the downsides, looked at alternatives, and consciously thought about the ethical implications of what you're doing, then it's not really an ethical issue. It's a different standard that you're applying, which gets mixed up and labelled as ethics in society. So what we can see is that sustainability goals like the UN SDG and the CSR initiatives that flow from time to time more reflect social pressure and values than they do any universal moral law. Enough people agree with this certain approach that those pressures come on business to comply, irrespective of what the owners may think about them from an ethical perspective, or the decision makers and managers, not just the owners. So I really want you to be able to differentiate between these standards so that you can think ethically, and you are going to be subject to these pressures, something we'll do in our next video when we start looking at the impact of biases on our decision making.